Manuel Antonio Noriega Moreno, Spanish pronunciation, Manuel Noriega, February 11, 1934 – May 29, 2017, was a Panamanian politician and military officer. He was military dictator of Panama from 1983 to 1989, when he was removed from power by the United States during the invasion of Panama. From the 1950s until shortly before the U.S. invasion, Noriega worked closely with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Noriega was one of the CIA's most valued intelligence sources, as well as one of the primary conduits for illicit weapons, military equipment and cash destined for U.S.-backed counterinsurgency forces throughout Central and South America. Noriega was also a major cocaine trafficker, something which his U.S. intelligence handlers were aware of for years, but allowed because of his usefulness for their covert military operations in Latin America. In 1988, Noriega was indicted by the United States on drug trafficking charges in Miami, Florida. During the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama, he was removed from power, captured, detained as a prisoner of war, and flown to the United States. Noriega was tried on 8 counts of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering in April 1992. On September 16, 1992, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison, which was later reduced to 30 years. Noriega's U.S. prison sentence ended in September 2007, pending the outcome of extradition requests by both Panama and France, for convictions in absentia for murder in 1995 and money laundering in 1999. France was granted its extradition request in April 2010. He arrived in Paris on April 27, 2010, and after the retrial, that is a rule in France after any in absentia sentence, he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in jail in July 2010. A conditional release was granted on September 23, 2011, for Noriega to be extradited to serve 20 years in Panama. He returned to Panama on December 11, 2011. Noriega died at Hospital Santo Tomas in Panama City on May 29, 2017, 2 months after brain surgery. Early life edit == Noriega was born in Panama City on February 11, 1934, into a relatively poor family of Colombian heritage. He was educated at the Instituto Nacional, a well-regarded high school in Panama City, before winning a scholarship to Chorrillos Military School in the Peruvian capital of Lima. He returned to Panama and was given a commission as a sub-lieutenant in the Panama National Guard, and posted to Colon. There he made the acquaintance of Omar Torrijos, and would become an important supporter of him. As a first lieutenant, Noriega traveled to the United States in 1967, and spent many months taking courses at the School of the Americas at the United States Army's Fort Gulick in the Panama Canal Zone. His training there included courses on infantry operations, counterintelligence, intelligence, and jungle operations. He also took a course in psychological operations at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Rise to power at == In 1968, Torrijos led a coup against Panama President Arnulfo Arias. Noriega was an important supporter of Torrijos during the power struggle that followed. He received a promotion to lieutenant colonel and was appointed chief of military intelligence by Torrijos. He would also play a major role in thwarting a later coup attempt against Torrijos. Torrijos would retain power as a military ruler until 1981. During this time he negotiated the Torrijos-Carter treaties with U.S. President Jimmy Carter, which ensured that control over the Panama Canal would pass to Panama in 1999. Torrijos died in a plane accident on July 31, 1981, under mysterious circumstances. After a brief power struggle between various military leaders, brought on by the absence of a clear protocol for transfer of power, Noriega became the real power behind the government as the head of the security forces. 2 years later, in 1983, Noriega promoted himself to colonel, giving him even more power. In the same year, Noriega made a deal with Ruby Acute and Dario Paredes, the leader of the Panamanian armed forces, under which Paredes handed over his position to Noriega with the understanding that Noriega would allow him to stand for president. However, after assuming his new position, Noriega reneged on the deal, arrested Paredes, and made himself general, thereby becoming the de facto ruler of the country. Noriega's tenure as the head of intelligence was marked by intimidation and harassment of opposition parties and their leaders. CIA involvement and U.S. supported it == Although the relationship did not become contractual until 1967, Noriega worked with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency (CIA) from the late 1950s until the 1980s. The relationship became regularized in the 1970s, when Noriega was on the CIA payroll. It has been suggested that Noriega began to be employed by the CIA as early as 1971. Noriega acted as a conduit for U.S. support to the Contra militants in Nicaragua for many years, including funds and weapons. Noriega also allowed the CIA to establish listening posts in Panama. He also helped the U.S.-backed Salvadoran government against the leftist Salvadoran insurgent Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. Noriega has been reported to have played a role in the Iran-Contra affair in the mid-1980s, in which weapons and drugs were smuggled by the U.S. government to support the Contras. Noriega would continue to have a close relationship with the U.S. School of the Americas during his presidency, partly due to the latter having an outpost in Panama. Officials from the Panamanian military were frequently given courses at the school free of charge. Noriega was proud of his relationship with the school, and would wear its crest on his military uniform. Historians would later suggest that the United States had known of Noriega's drug trafficking since the 1960s, and had been shielding him from investigation from the 1960s to the 1990s. A 1988 U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics and International Operations concluded, the saga of Panama's General Manuel Antonio Noriega represents one of the most serious foreign policy failures for the United States. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, Noriega was able to manipulate U.S. policy toward his country, while skillfully accumulating near absolute power in Panama. It is clear that each U.S. government agency which had a relationship with Noriega turned a blind eye to his corruption and drug dealing, even as he was emerging as a key player on behalf of the Medellin cartel, a member of which was notorious Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar. Noriega was allowed to establish the hemisphere's first narco-kleptocracy. One of the large financial institutions that he was able to use to launder money was the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. In the 1988 U.S. presidential election, Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis highlighted this history in a campaign commercial attacking his opponent, Vice President, and former CIA Director, George H. W. Bush, for his close relationship with Panamanian drug lord Noriega. De facto rule of Panama edit == 1984 election edit == In May 1984, Noriega allowed the first presidential elections in 16 years. When the initial results showed former President Arnulfo Arias on his way to a landslide victory, Noriega halted the count. After brazenly manipulating the results, the government announced that the PRD's candidate, Nicolas Ardito Barletta Valerino, had won by a slim margin of 1,713 votes. Independent estimates suggested that Arias would have won by as many as 50,000 votes had the election been conducted fairly. The U.S. government was aware of this manipulation, but chose not to comment on it. His rule in Panama became increasingly repressive, even as the U.S. government of Ronald Reagan began relying on him in its covert efforts to undermine the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Murder of Spadafora edit == Hugo Spadafora was a physician and a political activist who had first clashed with Noriega when they were both members of Torrijos' government. He was a vocal critic of Noriega. In September 1985 he accused Noriega of having connections to drug trafficking and announced his intent to return to Panama to oppose him. He was seized from a bus by a death squad at the Costa Rican border. Later, his decapitated body was found, showing signs of extreme torture, wrapped in a United States Postal Service mailing bag. His family and other groups called for an investigation into his murder, but Noriega stonewalled any attempts at an investigation. Noriega was in Paris at the time of the murder, which was alleged by some to have been at the direction of his Chiriquí province commander, Luis Córdoba. A conversation captured on wiretap between Noriega, in Paris, and Córdoba included an exchange in which Córdoba says, "We have the rabid dog," to which Noriega responds, "And what does one do with a dog that has rabies?" The murder of Spadafora was among the reasons for the U.S. beginning to view Noriega as a liability rather than an asset, despite his ongoing support for U.S. interventions elsewhere. Barletta and Herrera edit == President Barletta was visiting New York City at the time. A reporter asked him about the Spadafora matter, and he promised an investigation. Upon his return to Panama, he was summoned to FDP headquarters and told to resign. He was replaced by First Vice President Eric Arturo Del Val. As a friend and former student of George Shultz, Barletta had been considered sacrosanct by the United States, and his dismissal signaled a marked downturn in the relations between the U.S. and Noriega. Furthermore, after Torrijos' death, Noriega had made a deal with his deputy Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera, to the effect that he would step down as military leader in 1987 and allow Herrera to succeed him. In 1987, however, Noriega went back on this agreement, announced he would be heading the military for the next 5 years, and assigned Herrera to a diplomatic post. Herrera retaliated by making public statements accusing Noriega of rigging the 1984 election, murdering Spadafora, and of trafficking in drugs, as well as of assassinating Torrijos with a bomb on his plane. These statements provoked huge protests against Noriega Noriega, with 100,000 people, approximately 25 of the population of Panama City, marching in protest on June 26, 1987. Noriega charged Herrera with treason, and cracked down hard on the protesters. The U.S. Senate passed a resolution asking Noriega to step down until Herrera could be tried. In response, Noriega sent government workers to protest outside the U.S. Embassy, a protest which quickly turned into a riot. As a result, the U.S. suspended all military assistance to Panama, and the CIA stopped paying Noriega a salary. 1989 election edit == The relationship between the U.S. and Noriega deteriorated further during the late 1980s, particularly after the U.S. began to suspect that Noriega was lending his support to other intelligence services, as well as to drug trafficking groups. In 1988, Noriega was indicted in a U.S. court on charges of drug trafficking. The elections of May 1989 were surrounded by controversy. A PRD-led coalition nominated Carlos Duque, publisher of the country's oldest newspaper, La Estrella de Panama. Most of the other political parties banded behind a unified ticket of Guillermo Endara, a member of Arias' authentic Panamanista party, along with vice presidential candidates Ricardo Arias Calderón, no relation to Arnulfo Arias, and Guillermo Ford. According to Guillermo Sanchez, the opposition alliance knew that Noriega planned to rig the count, but had no way of proving it. They found a way through a loophole in Panamanian election law. The alliance, with the support of the Roman Catholic Church, set up a count based directly on results at the country's 4,000 election precincts before the results were sent to district centers. Noriega's lackeys swapped fake tally sheets for the real ones and took those to the district centers, but by this time the opposition's more accurate count was already out. It showed Endara winning in a landslide even more massive than in 1984, beating Duque by a 3-1 margin. Noriega had every intention of declaring Duque the winner regardless of the actual results. Duque knew he had been badly defeated and refused to go along. Rather than publish the results, Noriega voided the election, claiming foreign interference had tainted the results. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, present in Panama as an observer, denounced Noriega, saying the election had been stolen, as did Bishop Marcos G. McGrath. The next day, Endara, Arias Calderón, and Ford rolled through the old part of the capital in a triumphant motorcade, only to be intercepted by a detachment of Noriega's paramilitary dignity battalions. Arias Calderón was protected by a couple of troops, but Endara and Ford were badly beaten. Images of Ford running to safety with his Guayabera shirt covered in blood were broadcast around the world. When the 1984-89 presidential term expired, Noriega named a longtime associate, Francisco Rodriguez, as acting president. The United States recognized Endara as the new president. U.S. invasion of Panama edit == Genesis edit == On December 15, 1989, the PRD-dominated legislature spoke of a state of war between the United States and Panama. It also declared Noriega chief executive officer of the government, formalizing a state of affairs that had existed for 6 years. Noriega subsequently claimed that this statement referred to U.S. actions against Panama, and did not represent a declaration of hostilities by Panama. Noriega's forces are said to have engaged in routine harassment of U.S. troops and civilians. 3 incidents in particular occurred very near the time of the invasion, and were mentioned by U.S. President George H.W. Bush as a reason for invasion. In a December 16 incident, 4 U.S. personnel were stopped at a roadblock outside PDF headquarters in the El Chorrillo neighborhood of Panama City. The United States Department of Defense said that the servicemen were unarmed and in a private vehicle and that they attempted to flee the scene only after their vehicle was surrounded by a crowd of civilians and PDF troops. Robert Paz of the United States Marine Corps was shot and killed in the incident. The PDF claimed that the Americans were armed and on a reconnaissance mission. Invasion edit == The U.S. invasion of Panama was launched on December 20, 1989. Although the killing of the Marine was the ostensible reason for the invasion, the operation had been planned for months before his death. Losses on the U.S. side were 23 troops and 3 civilian casualties, while Panamanian losses were 150 troops and 500 civilian casualties. On December 29, the United Nations General Assembly voted 75-20 with 40 abstentions to condemn the invasion as a flagrant violation of international law. According to a CBS poll, 92 of Panamanian adults supported the U.S. incursion, and 76 wished that U.S. forces had invaded in October during the coup. Activist Barbara Trent disputed this finding, claiming in a 1992 Academy Award-winning documentary The Panama Deception that the Panamanian surveys were completed in wealthy, English-speaking neighborhoods in Panama City, among Panamanians most likely to support U.S. actions. Capture it On the fifth day of the invasion, Noriega and 4 others took sanctuary in the Apostolic Nunciature, the Holy See's embassy in Panama. Having threatened to flee to the countryside and lead guerrilla warfare if not given refuge, he instead turned over the majority of his weapons, and requested sanctuary from Monsignor Labo. He spent his time in a stark room with no air conditioning or television, reading the Bible for the duration of his stay. Prevented by treaty from invading the embassy of the Holy See, U.S. soldiers erected a perimeter around the nunciature. Psychological warfare was used in an attempt to dislodge him, including blaring rock music, and turning a nearby field into a helicopter landing zone. After 10 days of Operation Nifty Package, Noriega surrendered on January 3, 1990. He was detained as a prisoner of war, and later taken to the United States. Prosecution in the United States edit trial edit In April 1992 a trial was held in Miami, Florida, at the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida in which Noriega was tried and convicted on 8 counts of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. At his trial, Noriega intended to defend himself by presenting his alleged crimes within the framework of his work for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. The government objected to any disclosure of the purposes for which the United States had paid Noriega because this information was classified and its disclosure went against the interests of the United States. In pre-trial proceedings, the government offered to stipulate that Noriega had received approximately $220,000 from the United States Army and the Central Intelligence Agency. Noriega insisted that the actual figure approached $10 million, and that he should be allowed to disclose the tasks he had performed for the United States. The district court held that the information about the content of the discrete operations in which Noriega had engaged in exchange for the alleged payments was irrelevant to his defense. It ruled that the introduction of evidence about Noriega's role in the CIA would confuse the jury. After the trial, Noriega appealed this exclusionary ruling by the judge to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. The Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the government, despite disagreeing with the lower court. It said, "Our review leads us to conclude that information regarding the purposes for which the United States previously paid Noriega potentially had some probative value. Thus, the district court may have overstated the case when it declared evidence of the purposes for which the United States allegedly paid Noriega wholly irrelevant to his defense." The Court of Appeals refused to set aside the verdict because it felt that the potential probative value of this material, however, was relatively marginal. On September 16, 1992, Noriega was sentenced to 40 years in prison, later reduced to 30 years. Incarceration edit Before receiving his permanent prison assignment, Noriega was placed in the Federal Detention Center, Miami, facility. Noriega resided in the Federal Correctional Institution, Miami, in an unincorporated area of Dade County, Florida, and had the Federal Bureau of Prisons ID number 38699-079. Under Article 85 of the Third Geneva Convention, Noriega was considered a prisoner of war, despite his conviction for acts committed prior to his capture by the detaining power, the United States. This status meant that in Florida he had his own prison cell, furnished with electronics and exercise equipment. His cell had been nicknamed the Presidential Suite. It was reported that Noriega had been visited by evangelical Christians, who claimed that he had become a born-again Christian. On May 15 and 16, 1990, while Noriega still awaited trial, Clift Brannon, a former attorney-turned-preacher, and a Spanish interpreter, Rudy Hernandez, were allowed to visit Noriega for a total of 6 hours at the Metropolitan Correctional Center of Dade County, Florida. Following the visit, Noriega wrote Brannon a letter stating, "Noriega's prison sentence was reduced from 30 years to 17 years for good behavior." After serving 17 years in detention and imprisonment, his sentence ended on September 9, 2007. Prosecution in France The French government requested Noriega's extradition after he was convicted of money laundering in 1999. The French claimed that Noriega had laundered $3 million in drug proceeds by purchasing luxury apartments in Paris. Noriega was convicted in absentia, but French law requires a new trial after the subject of an in absentia sentence is apprehended. He faced up to 10 years in French prison if convicted. In August 2007, a U.S. federal judge approved a request from the French government to extradite Noriega from the United States to France after his release. Noriega has also received a long jail term in absentia in Panama for murder and human rights abuses. Noriega appealed his extradition to France because he claimed that country would not honor his legal status as a prisoner of war. In 1999, the Panamanian government sought the extradition of Noriega to face murder charges in Panama because he had been found guilty in absentia in 1995 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. On February 20, 2010, Noriega's lawyers filed a petition with the Supreme Court of the United States to block his extradition to France, after the court refused to hear his appeal the previous month. Noriega's attorneys had hoped the dissenting opinion in that ruling, written by Justices Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia, would convince the full court to take up his case, but on March 22, 2010, the Supreme Court refused to hear the petition. 2 days after the refusal, the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida in Miami lifted the stay that was blocking Noriega's extradition. Later that month, after Secretary of State Hillary Clinton signed the surrender warrant, Noriega's attorney stated that he would travel to France and try to arrange a deal with the French government. On April 26, 2010, Noriega was extradited to France. Noriega's lawyers claimed the La Santé prison, at which he was held, was unfit for a man of his age and rank. The French government refused to grant him prisoner of war status, as he had in the United States. On July 7, 2010, Noriega was convicted by the 11th Chamber of the Tribunal Correctional de Paris and sentenced to 7 years in jail. The prosecutor in the case had sought a 10-year prison term. In addition, the court ordered the seizure of €2.3 million, approximately $3.6 million, that had long been frozen in Noriega's French bank accounts. Return, death, and legacy. Edit Panama asked France to extradite Noriega so he could face trial for human rights violations in Panama. The French government had previously stated that extradition would not happen before the case in France had run its course. On September 23, 2011, a French court ordered a conditional release for Noriega to be extradited to Panama on October 1, 2011. Noriega was extradited to Panama on December 11, 2011, and incarcerated at El Renacer prison to serve time for crimes committed during his rule. On February 5, 2012, Noriega was moved from the El Renacer prison to the Hospital Santo Tomas because of high blood pressure and a brain hemorrhage. He remained in the hospital for 4 days before being returned to prison. It was announced on March 21, 2012, that Noriega was diagnosed with a brain tumor, which was later revealed to have been benign. On January 23, 2017, he was released from prison and placed under house arrest to prepare for surgery that would remove the tumor. On March 7, 2017, he suffered a brain hemorrhage during surgery which left him in critical condition in the intensive care unit of Santo Tomas Hospital in Panama City. Noriega died on May 29, 2017, at the age of 83. Panamanian President Juan Carlos Varela announced Noriega's death on Twitter shortly before midnight, writing, "The death of Manuel Noriega closes a chapter in our history. His daughters and his relatives deserve to bury him in peace." Noriega's rule in Panama has been frequently described as a dictatorship, while Noriega is often referred to as a strongman. A 2017 obituary stated that Noriega was an opportunist who used his close relationship with the United States to boost his own power in Panama and to cover the illegal activities for which he was eventually convicted. In popular culture. British actor Bob Hoskins portrayed Manuel Noriega in the biographical 2000 TV movie Noriega, God's Favorite. The film was described as a political drama with profound stakes, that was nonetheless depicted with wild humor. A reviewer wrote that the hair-raising career of deposed Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega surpassed even the surreal creations of many Latin American novelists, thus making him a natural movie subject. Hoskins was nominated for a Satellite Award for his role in the film. Noriega was depicted in Call of Duty: Black Ops 2. In July 2014, he filed a lawsuit against the game company Activision for depicting him and using his name without his permission. Noriega, who filed the suit while in prison for murder, claims he is portrayed as a kidnapper, murderer and enemy of the state. In gameplay, Noriega's character is referred to as Old Pineapple Face by fictional character Frank Woods. The name Old Pineapple Face was an actual nickname for Noriega used by Panamanians. On October 28, 2014, the case against Activision was dismissed. A word said it Legion Dunner, France, 1987. See also edit Sarah York, references did bibliography did further reading did external links edit the official archives of General Manuel Antonio Noriega. Noriega co-defendant, Ricardo Bilinic only came forward after the Cali drug cartel paid him $1.25 million. Another Panamanian paid for his testimony against Noriega was Ricardo Bilinic. Ricardo Bilinic emerges as key figure in Noriega's quest request for a retrial. Narco-trafficker and Noriega associate, Ricardo Bilinek, defends Mexican drug cartel operatives. 2010. Description of 1989 raid on Patila Airport, resulting in deaths of U.S. Navy SEALs. 1989 report on the situation of human rights in Panama by Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. In exchange for his testimony against Noriega, Ricardo Bilinek was allowed to keep the $47 million he made smuggling cocaine for the Medellin drug cartel. R.M. Coster's response to claims made in Noriega's biography. Noriega suffers mild stroke, hospitalized in Miami. CNN.com. My pen pal, the story of Sarah York, a girl from a small Michigan town who was a pen pal with Noriega, beginning c. 1988. Noriega co-defendant, Ricardo Bilinek, was paid for his testimony by the Cali drug cartel. The conversion of Manuel Noriega, American Rehabilitation Ministries. Noriega's profession of faith in Jesus Christ and his baptism in 1992 are chronicled. Noriega co-defendant, Ricardo Bilinek smuggled 40,000 pounds of cocaine into the U.S. and received a 3-year sentence.